Guglielmo, thank you for joining us at BCEA annual conference. You're a fellow postdoctoral researcher and you are currently at Harvard University and soon you will be joining the Bocconi University as faculty. Could you tell us a little bit about your research interests and the questions that motivate your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard and I'm joining Bocconi in the fall. I'm an environmental economist and in particular I'm interested in questions like what is the socioeconomic impact of climate change and in particular understanding how human societies can adapt to these climate shocks. I believe that there are some parts of climate change and climate shocks that are non-mechanical and communities and individuals can adjust to these shocks and I'm interested in understanding what is stopping society to adjust and adapt to these shocks. Some questions that I'm interested in regard, for example, how farmers and smallholder communities in Pakistan adapt to climate shocks by buying insurance, or more from a global perspective about the role of supply chain linkages, trade and migration for climate shocks.
This is really interesting and very relevant line of research. And you mentioned your methods. Many researchers use administrative or survey data, but your project involved a field experiment. What would you say was the biggest challenge or perhaps the biggest lesson from conducting a randomized control trial among farmers in Punjab?
Yeah, I mean, I've started exploring our cities very recently, and I think it's an exciting method that is going to gain even more importance going forward in terms of the importance of primary data collection. I will say that I think that we used to think about randomization especially as being the most important challenge when we think about observational data and quasi-experimental analysis. I think that in our cities this is actually fairly trivial once the design is settled. One of the most important challenges is that most of the design and the formulation of the hypothesis has to happen before the data collection phase. And so one has really to think very carefully about rather whether an intervention works, but rather why it works. And so you have to really think about what are the competing hypotheses and now what is the best way to try to address these hypotheses and test them in the data before actually going on the field and collecting the data themselves.
Thank you for these insights. What takeaways would you then say are most relevant for policymakers in countries like Bulgaria where agriculture is also playing an important economic role?
Yeah, I mean, going more into detail, our RCT has a very simple information provision experiment, and we find that the effect of this information provision is very large in terms of determining the demand for crop insurance. And so I think that in general, one takeaway from our research and maybe more broadly from this trend of the literature is that information still plays a very important role and is still one of the cheapest policy levers that one can play. And so maybe there's future research in thinking about how to design effective information and communication strategies.
Maybe lastly, looking ahead, what are some of the research questions you would like to study next?
Well, I think again, I think the collection of new data is really the most exciting part, and I'm exploring these days other avenues again in Pakistan, which is again is very important to establish good connection with field partners and stakeholders there, and so we're going to develop new RCTs in that context to understand again what are the main constraints and friction to adaptation in developing countries.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your research interests, and what motivated you to pursue topics in development and gender differences?
Hi, I'm Karmini and I am an assistant professor, faculty member at Imperial College London at the Economics and Public Policy Department. And I work on topics related to gender. In particular, I focus a lot on developing countries. One of the key reasons I do that is that I grew up in a country where there are a lot of regressive attitudes towards gender, but I've realized that was not just about my country, it's true about many developed countries I've been to as well. And that motivated me to really take on the topic of gender. And one of the key things that I actually presented here as well at Sophia University was about attribution bias by gender. And that's something I think that's relevant for not just, as I said, not just developing countries, but also developed countries. So I think it's a very generalizable topic as well. So that's why I pursue it, because it's highly policy relevant.
Would you mind telling us what the main takeaways of these research projects are?
So the project that I presented was an online experiment, and one of the key things that we study in this project is whether there is attribution bias by gender, and we study attribution bias primarily against women, and then we also show that there might be attribution bias against men, but it's kind of a little bit less relevant in today's world, and I'll tell you why. So firstly, attribution bias is when you simply to put it in one word, if like a woman fails, then you are likely to say that she was bad or she was low ability. But if a man fails, you're willing to kind of give him a chance and benefit of doubt, and you'll say maybe he was just unlucky. And so we wanted to test it explicitly as a mechanism in a lab experiment, and we find that in male-dominated or male-type domains, there is attribution bias by gender against women. But then we also add to this, and we find that actually in even female-type domains, there is attribution bias against men. Now, why that might, even though that's super interesting theoretically and research-wise, it is a little bit less, I would say, economically interesting, and that's because we find, in general, pay gaps are just much larger in male-dominated domains, and wages in general and salaries are much higher in that domain. So women lose out much more as a result of that discrimination than men. And so in general, we were motivated to see whether it does exist, and we show that it does.
What would you say are maybe the main lessons or takeaways for policy makers and employers that they can learn and perhaps adopt?
I think that the whole topic is super relevant for workplaces, because the way that we show it is that a potential employer can have attribution bias against their female employees or their female managers or even female top executives, and so I think in general any type of discrimination against a particular group is just very problematic for a firm, because they lose out on productive workers and productivity of workers. And I think that what is super important to kind of deal with this kind of bias is to have sort of these subconscious attitude trainings, because in general people might not be overtly discriminatory, but attribution bias, for instance, is a type of discrimination that can happen kind of under the radar and subconsciously. And so to make people aware, in particular managers and hiring committees aware of these subconscious biases, can be a very good policy that top companies and in general workplaces can employ to reduce this bias.
Maybe as a last point, would you like to tell us what perhaps the next questions are that you would like to study in this line of work?
Yeah, so it was really nice to be presenting here at Sophia, and we got kind of good comments about what is the next thing that we can be doing. And as I said, one of the things that we want to do, and we want to take this research path forward, is to look at what kind of interventions can help reduce this bias. So one of the interventions we are thinking about is giving people information that, hey, this is the kind of bias that we found in other contexts, and now we want to run the same experiment with that information and see whether that reduces the bias.
Tell the wider public who you are and what your research interests are.
So I'm Elias Papaioannou. I'm a professor of economics at the London Business School. My research is mainly on political economy, economic history, international finance, ranging from cross-border determinants of capital flows, the impacts of financial globalization, the legacy of colonization, forced displacement, anything that I find interesting.
Thank you. So today you will talk to us about populism and the flavor of populism that usually comes with those authoritarian sentiments. When I think about populism, I'm thinking about maybe economic inequality or insecurity, maybe cultural factors, also the effects of globalization. If you had to disentangle those contextual factors and try to pinpoint and assign some explanatory primacy to one of those factors, what would it be, or is it too simplistic to put it that way?
Well, economists have started thinking about populism, I would say, in the 80s, but having a very Latin American viewpoint. So when I did economics as a PhD, populism was kind of a synonym of Latin American inefficient policies. However, post-1990 and the fall of the Iron Curtain, the concept of populism has changed. So it's less so inflation, debt finance, they're trying to deal with inequality with inefficient policies, and more based on identity, us versus the corrupt elites. So I'll try to cover exciting recent research, mainly applied on the drivers of populism and its implications. Economists tend to think of cultural versus economic drivers of populism. reality is kind of more complex because, for example, immigration has both an economic and a cultural kind of impact. It is clear that economic shocks related to globalization or related to the 2007-2009 global financial crisis have contributed. The key question is how much and for how long those shocks will persist.
Proponents of liberal democracy, I feel like, have a difficulty of putting their message across, sort of a difficulty not only speaking to the people, but also kind of packaging their ideas in a way that makes sense to them. Do you think that's one of the explanations as to why we see that surge in populism, or is it more so the structural factors?
That's a fantastic question. I think this is exactly where current research is. Economists need to embrace with humility insights from marketing, from behavioral science. So we now have some applied economic research trying to think through this lens. So what makes the populist message, especially when coming from the far right, so entertaining? Why people, when they look on Twitter political messages, they tend to retweet more messages that come from far-right, nationalistic, anti-immigration kind of politicians or podcasters or influential policymakers. So this, I think we are not exactly there yet, but I think in the next 5 years we will see a lot of research on that.
What do you see as the path forward for Greece in order to see the full recovery that we all hope it has?
Well, Greece suffered an unprecedented during peacetime economic recession, a fourth of its output loss, unemployment reaching 30%, more than 500,000 Greeks fleeing abroad during the crisis. So the crisis also lasted for 10 years, which psychologically had a significant toll to the Greek people. So now we see some recovery, although still economic growth hovers around 2%, which is far from satisfactory for a country that lost a fourth of its output. Greece needs to do way more ambitious reforms. It's hard, especially when the psyche of the people and their memory of the crisis is still lingering. And they need to embrace, in a much more aggressive and ambitious way, institutional and market reforms to grow in the years to come.
As I introduced him yesterday in terms of his publication track record, he has published in all the so-called top 5 economic journals. And he has also published in the Journal of Finance, which is the premier finance journal. And he has also published in Nature. So that's a really impressive publication record. He's a joint managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies and a fellow of the British Academy, CPR research fellow. Professor Papaioannou has held positions at the European Central Bank. And a funny anecdote here that Alex Popov mentioned was that when he left, there was a position open for growth in finance, and then Alex got hired in his position. So I guess you had some pretty big shoes to fill. So that's kind of an interesting anecdote that connects people and places. He has also taught at Dartmouth, Harvard, and has been the Varian Visiting Professor of Economics at MIT in 2019-2020. His research has been recognized with a Consolidator grant from the ERC, the inaugural European Investment Bank Young Economist Award, the European Economic Association's Young Economist Award, and the Royal Economic Association's Austin Robbins Memorial Prize. And Elias, you mentioned that you will be the chair of the European Economic Association starting 2028. So he will also be the chair of the EEA in 2028. So now it's time for the keynote. So Elias, please.
Can you all hear me? So thanks a lot for your very kind invitation, your kind words. It's great to be in Sofia for the very first time. So let me just preamble that you were very kind with your introduction. This work that I will present is not particularly original. So with my boss now, at the time good friend, still good friend I guess, Sergei Guriev, We were asked to do a review for the Journal of Economic Literature at research on this topic that was gaining steam in the 2010s in economics on populism, so I'll try to kind of give an overview of what we know and actually the many things that we do not know. So perhaps this would be also some good ideas for PhD students or young scholars to start thinking about those issues. And let me just say, many things will be kind of speculative. I will try to stress what are the more concrete lessons we know, what are the more, if you like, speculative things that we do not know. So the first kind of motivation, I don't think I need a motivation, other than, I come from London. We just had, I don't know, the 7th Prime Minister just resigned in the period from Brexit till today. So the gentleman on the right, whether you like it or not, has been the most instrumental and influential politician in the UK, at least since Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. One could say, even compared his influence to Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. Now, what is kind of interesting, and those slides are intentionally picked. So what you see on the right is the front page of The Sun. This is the tabloid. Typically they don't cover politics, but the Kardashians or their British analog. So what is kind of interesting is Queen backs Brexit. Why did I pick this? Any ideas? Well, the Queen never made any statement about Brexit. The British royalty are very smart not to get involved in politics. They're not like the former royal family of Greece that they kept intervening and then they were kicked out. So this is kind of fake news. The gentleman on the left, Nigel Farage, is in front of a very big queue of destitute refugees. Again, it's fault. So, someone did it in PowerPoint. I guess now you can do it at Grok. So these are very early indications of fake news or messages packaged very well, trying to convey a political kind of message. Who are those three gentlemen? So they are judges. And back in 2015-16, when Brexit referendum happened, there was a discussion on whether this immediately means that the United Kingdom needs to inform the European Union that the process has initiated, or whether there has to be a parliamentary act. So what those judges said and ruled is that since in England, in the United Kingdom, so-called parliament is sovereign, that the parliament had to convene and just enact a bill, a very simple bill, authorizing the government to initiate the process of Brexit. They were deemed enemies of the people and corrupt elites that they are serving the other elites. So it was an indication of anti-institutions, if you like, or authoritarianism, a bit kind of hidden, and I will try to come about that. Of course, today, the new world order is perhaps experiencing cracks. Some would say that we see a transformation with this global surge of populism and authoritarianism kind of being exported to the rest of the world. You can think about economic policy uncertainty. These are the statistics that Steve Davis and Nick Bloom compile with the peaks during Liberation Day and kind of ups and downs. These were the statistics that during the global financial crisis actually were skyrocketing. I'll try to also, perhaps during the discussion, and since many of you come from finance, there's also kind of a very interesting discussion. There was a great paper yesterday on the exorbitant privilege. There was a kind of interesting work on cross-border capital flows and whether now the populism that we see at the core of the global financial system will have implications for investors from across the world. There was a great, let me just remind you that yesterday there was this super interesting kind of feature of the global financial systems that effectively all countries in the world, but a few, have significant exposure to the US. So the US is offering safe assets, so this would be the treasuries, but increasingly so also exposure to the Magnificent Seven and other kind of stocks. So what I'll try to do, and I just came from Venice where there was a CPR conference on this issue, and we had a lot of discussion what on earth is populism and how can we define it. Trying to put the Greek hat, the Greeks tend to believe that everything started with them, so it's It's deeply entrenched in the Greek psyche. Well, how can we define things? It's not so easy. Antisthenes, who was kind of the he had like a kind of a conflictious relationship with Socrates, said, look, sometimes things are hard to define, so let's try to look at people, onomatones, or like persons, names. So you Google search populism, this gentleman will appear, I think, still today, top of the list. So this is Juan Perón, with his second wife, Eva Perón, and his third wife, Juanita Perón. Both of them were vice presidents, so they ran together. Eva Perón was, actually there was a formal petition of Argentina for her to become a saint. Juanita also became briefly president of the country for a couple of months. So you go to Google, populism, someone like clearly Perón will appear there. Just because this is an economics conference, I really want to, I picked two great quotes. I think the second is the best, where he gives advice to the newly elected president of Chile. And he tells him, give the people, especially the workers, all that is possible. When it seems to you that if you have already given them too much, give them more. So this is not the advice that I guess the council wants to offer to the president and the government here. Perón continues, you will see the results. Everybody will try to frighten you, so Alexei or Georgi, someone here will say, don't do it, forget them, keep doing it. So for many years, however, populism, at least when I did my PhD, populism was something that, I don't know, it would be part of macroeconomics, a bit in the end. There would be some work, some reference to the work of Rudy Dornbusch, perhaps the most influential, at least in my generation, international economist, and it would be something discussed through the lens of fiscal policy. What I guess John Cochrane today calls the fiscal theory of the price level, something along those lines. But the new populists are somewhat different. Fiscal policy features, but clearly it's not core. And one could say, look, I understand that we live in a period of rising inflation, that the lessons of the old-style populists of the 70s and the 60s in Latin America have somewhat, or to a great extent, someone might say, have been learned, and now the political discourse has kind of changed. So the new faces of Latin American populism, you see some people coming, quote unquote, from the left, like Evo Morales, but also dudes like Bolsonaro, who is coming on the right, from the right. And clearly, although redistribution is part of the story, clearly is not the top of the priorities, at least of policy leaders such as Trump or Nigel Farage or Viktor Orban, to pick a few. So how can we define things? So right now, the dominant or the most widely accepted definition of populism comes from polyscience, from Cass Mood, where effectively Mood defines populism as follows. I think we are here in a room of, let's say, 100 people. We are very heterogeneous. We come from different parts of Bulgaria or the world. We do different research, different family backgrounds. So a good populist will try to do the following. Will try to say, look, there is a group of people, the majority, Alex, me, they work at the ECB, like an evil institution or something. So these are the pure people. And then you have the corrupt elite, so you have like a couple of, let's say, 2, 3 that are deemed as the corrupt elite. Now, what is kind of interesting is that you split the society into two groups that are very homogeneous within, no variation, so all pure people are the same, although obviously they're not. All elites are the same, so the judges, the academics, the consultants, the investment bankers, if you want to think about America, the old aristocracy perhaps in some cases. And those two groups couldn't be further apart. So you try to move the two groups as far as you literally can. So although it's not explicit, there is an anti-institutions or authoritarian element, because the minute you take as given that the people are pure and the elites are corrupt, it means that those judges are not doing their service. They are in some sense puppets or conduits of the power of the elites. Now, you can be more explicit, so this comes again from two American political scientists having a lot in mind Trump and the rise of authoritarianism in the US, where very explicitly make the connection between populism and authoritarianism. And let me just contrast this with the old definition by Rudy Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards, having a very Latin American kind of focus, where populism effectively is inefficient fiscal policy. It's borrowing either from the people in terms of hyperinflation, like generating hyperinflation, or from abroad and then disgorging to the populace, whatever they want in terms of handouts, if you like. So we have seen this transformation of the concept of populism, and nowadays we have issues related to morality, to identity. Anti-immigration could be thought through those lenses, anti-establishment at the core rather than fiscal policy. It's not that fiscal policy has disappeared, by no means, but it's now one part of it rather than being the focus as it used to be in the past. Now, I was debating whether to take this part in or out, but I think it's kind of, here I will not cover a lot of research, but I'll try to get at least my understanding of how we have ended up where we are, because I think this is going to also important of how things will play out. So these are just some statistics on the surge of populism, where effectively, I don't know how you can see, in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s, populism is mainly coming from the left, and this gray part mainly reflects people like Perón, coming from some vintage of the left, although left in a Latin American kind of definition of the word. But then post-2000 and especially 2010, we see a surge of populism, but now a lot of populist leaders are a bit like Bolsonaro and Trump rather than Perón, so coming also from the right. So if I was to go a bit back, so this is Berlin, this is Warsaw at the end of World War II. I think we can distinguish between the following phases, and my hunch, although I cannot back it with research yet, I think we are clearly now moving to a new phase. So we have a phase, let me call it from reconstruction, where to a great extent, both the United States and continental Europe, also Japan, what at the time was coined as the first world, the gentleman on the left, in some sense, was the most important, although at the time, by the time he had died. Why? Because during the Great Recession, the New Deal policies kind of worked. Obviously, America was instrumental during World War II. And during World War II, we had a kind of very interesting symbiosis of the public with private companies and universities. We had the NSF, was established immediately at the end of World War II. The National Institutes of Health expanded massively. So there is kind of this interesting, and also internationally, Keynes and White during the Bretton Woods system, they had in mind a very strong state. Obviously, the private sector was there, but the business model was to a great extent state-driven. Not like Bulgaria or what at the time was deemed as the Second World, but the state was there. It was regulating, it was taxing, it was intervening in the economy. And let me just say that my great colleague Paolo Surico has very exciting kind of work showing the legacy of many innovations that came from the symbiotic relations between the state and the private sector, which in the US starts with World War II. So DARPA, the GPS, the jumbo jet, penicillin, which although it was developed in the 30s, actually it expanded massively during World War II. So many of the innovations, like antibiotics that we tend to associate the rise of the US, again, it's not that they were done by the state, but the state was kind of instrumental in this model. However, this system of significant state intervention in the economy experiences its significant cracks in the 70s during this epoch of, or decade of stagflation. For some of you, actually let me say, Bulgarian economist Milena has done very interesting work on media and economics and the role of advertisement. So I'm surprised there's not more work on that. So what you see down there, labor isn't working, is, according to political scientists and people in marketing, supposed to be one of the very best political advertisements of all time. So this was the advertisement of Margaret that led to Margaret Thatcher winning the elections. in the late 70s. So as you know, in English, labor means both the Labour Party, but also labor. People are queuing, so it's an indication that this system of state intervention, high inflation, low economic activity, or you prefer high unemployment, it comes to cracks. Inflation is the enemy, workers protest. Those two individuals, very charismatic, extremely influential, reflecting also a lot of work in economics at the University of Minnesota and the University of Chicago, take power with an effort to liberalize. Let's open up. Now, interestingly enough, the decisions that were taken in Washington and London kind of get exported to the rest of the world, what at the time was deemed the third world, through the so-called Washington Consensus. IMF programs in the 80s, starting with Latin America in the 80s and expanding to Asia in the 90s. So this idea that let's reduce the role of the states, let's open up markets and increasingly open up financial markets became kind of part of the doctrine. Let me add a small digression here. If you read their speeches, and if you read remarks of the Treasury secretaries at the time, you know, Jimmy Baker, for example, they were very, very cautious towards financial globalization. So I think it relates a bit also to your work. They were interested in opening up product markets in the country. They were keen to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but on finance, you know, not the socialists, those people were kind of, let's go gradually, let's experiment, let's not get, you know, let's not move fast at the minimum. Interestingly enough, in what at the time was the second world, and here, you know, Michael Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping were kind of also trying to open up. Of course, opening up in the Soviet Union or in China in the 80s meant something different than in the US or the UK. But again, there was this effort even from the second world to kind of open up. So we lead now to kind of an ideological convergence that very foolishly has been coined by Francis Fukuyama as the end of history. The lesson here for all of us is that you can say something foolish, but if you have good marketing, you know, you can make it big. So there was, I guess, this euphoria when the Iron Curtain fell and countries such as Bulgaria, such as Romania, such as Russia kind of joined the first world and at the time the third world. And then we have, I would say, those two individuals, perhaps also Merkel and Schroeder, where we have this massive ideological convergence. In some sense, the labor renames itself as New Labour, embracing some of the policies of Thatcher on the economic side. And over time, the right, the center right, so this would be Merkel, kind of embraces some of the social agenda that was coming historically from the left, like gender rights, more rights to minorities, let's push for more female labor force participation. So we have like this ideological convergence. Actually, this slide was put before the death of Alan Greenspan yesterday. And then we have this kind of interesting trio in the United States. Alan Greenspan, Rubin, and Larry Summers. There was, if you recall, a minor crisis, in retrospect, when a hedge fund went under in 1998, LTCM, when Russia defaulted. And there was now this view that with good technocratic rule, we can proceed now massively on trade liberalization and trade integration, and I would say even more aggressively on financial integration, not only within the US, but also across the world. Now, during this period, so this comes from the work of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, inequalities kind of the rise. At the time, we don't have this research, so it's not clear what is happening. But rather than show you, let me just show you something that I think is kind of, from the quantitative statistics to me, what is the most kind of striking. So I guess all of us, when we take a class on economic growth, Chad Jones has this interesting piece, The Facts of Growth. So fact number one is that trend growth in the frontier is around 2%. Since we have good measures of growth in the US, it seems that the US has been growing at, roughly speaking, 2%. Well, now this comes from the income side. So what you see is that in the period post-World War II up until 1980, this magic 2% growth occurred for almost all Americans, independently on whether they were at the median, they were kind of the upper middle class, let's say at the 80th percentile, whether they were among the lower middle class. Post-1980, so post those reforms, although causality is very hard to prove, something interesting has happened. First of all, the income growth has fallen from an annualized rate of around 2 to around 1.5, which is far from trivial because it accumulates over 3 decades. Secondly, most Americans actually, their income grows at a much lower rate, and most of the gains come from those top income earners, reflecting developments either at the top, and if one delves into the data, coming more from the very, very top of the income distribution. And also, very interesting work by Russ Shetty, Nate Hendren, and John Friedman kind of shows that the American dream here measured as the likelihood that Elias will do better than his parents, or that Alex will do better than his parents, is kind of precipitously falling in the US. So the crisis occurs. This is 2008-9. Happened to work in the US at the time, so it was a very interesting kind of experience. Then policymakers, many of them coming from the academic side, most prominently Ben Bernanke, learning or having studied the Great Depression, effectively go all in after some back and forth with Lehman and Bear Stearns in bailing out the system. Let me just say, especially for the younger people here, the Europeans were also pushing Americans to bail out the banks because they could see the global implications and the contagion coming from the debacle and the fall down of the American financial system. Nonetheless, nonetheless, because this happened, at the time in the US, in places such as Dartmouth, and then I moved to Harvard for 2 years, there was an Occupy Dartmouth and then an Occupy Harvard movement. What were those movements? Some students, interestingly enough, many coming from very rich families, at least the Greeks that I knew, kind of camped inside Harvard Square with my colleagues. At the time I was very junior, so I was just attending those Harvard professional meetings, just listening. They were all dismissive. Oh, by the time we will come back from the Christmas holidays, they will be gone. You know, Boston can become very, very cold in the winter. But they stayed. The same at Dartmouth, and Dartmouth is even more cold than Boston. So you had like this movement that started from Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, that expanded in the campuses with an agenda, let me not call it populist, you could if you like, I wouldn't say so, more taxes, more redistribution. Don't bail out the bankers. I mean, the bankers were already bailed out. We want a more equal society. I guess as Bulgarians, you can see where this goes. But then you had another movement. Let me say, my colleagues at Dartmouth and at Harvard were even more dismissive of them. They were deemed as crazy or lunatics or blah, blah, blah. You can put any adjective you like. The so-called Tea Party movement, coming from a very libertarian, I would say, viewpoint. Actually, it was the very first time we had a debate, I think at Dartmouth, why we need a central bank. Why don't we go back to the earlier period where you had banks or various monarchs and kings and dukes in Europe issuing their own currency? At the time, nobody paid attention to them, to the Tea Party movement. Most of the attention was on the Occupy Wall Street movement. But in the 2010 midterms, they became one of the leading forces of the Republican Party, and I think it's fair to say that Trump and many people of the MAGA movement, their offspring is this movement. So massive dissatisfaction, and I would say this is the time when new populism kind of emerges. It is the crisis, and I'll cover some research on that. I would say it is also this idea, although there is no good research there, and I'm pretty sure people can write good papers, that the system is unfair. That, let me say, it was dominant. You could see it back at the time in Wall Street. You could see it with, you had friends who were ridiculously rich working as consultants or investment bankers, and over dinner and very nice wine, they would still tell you the system is unfair. So imagine, the people who had lost their job, how would they respond? So what do we know about the rise of populism mostly in the past 15, perhaps 20 years? Now, I don't know whether I will have time to cover all of the research, but we have some evidence that economic features, either secular, related to automation and trade globalization, or crisis-related, played a role. Immigration is less clear, despite immigration being featured prominently in the agenda of many so-called populist leaders. Culture tends to matter, but culture is relatively slow moving over time, so it's really hard to identify quote-unquote shocks. And I think we have many very exciting work by Matt Gensko, by Jesse Shapiro, by Ruben Durante, Sergei Guriev, as I said, Milena has some interesting work there, that social media, internet, increasingly so this online segregation plays a crucial role in the spread of populism, and increasingly more and more work related to mental health and loneliness, issues that might subsequently spur the populist movement. So let me start with trade and automation. This is, I keep telling my students in the MBAs that if you are to remember one graph from the World Economy elective I co-teach with Paulo Surico, this is the graph that they should remember. The US loses a third of its workforce, 7 million jobs, in roughly speaking 7 years. The so-called China shock, thanks to the work of David Dorn, David Otter, and Gordon Hanson, there has been a lot of work, perhaps one could say too much, but there is clearly a lot, that areas that had industries, had industrial specialization, let's say on footwear or textile, where the prices of imports fell precipitously after China joining the WTO, were the ones where unemployment rose, although to be fair, in the US labor force non-participation rose the most. There was kind of a social crisis. This actually correlates with many bad outcomes, not only going for populist leaders, but loneliness, divorce rates, violence against women. Very interesting work by Angus Deaton and Annie Case that this correlates actually with the spread of the opioid pandemic in the US. So there seems to be something there, which I think economists, we have documented empirically, but conceptually we don't fully understand why manufacturing, at least to politicians, to people's mind, features way more prominently, let's say, than consulting or some service activity. So, and many other works have applied this kind of trade being a contributing factor to an opposition from the people to globalization and, if you like, to populism more specifically. So these are like some of the questions that are still, I think, still are there. An interesting, I think, also question is why something that happened in the 2010s still persists today and resonates with people so much. Any economist, I think, will tell to policymakers, look, it's great if Bulgaria develops manufacturing, but manufacturing today will not be as labor intensive as it used to be back under Zhivkov's time. So, although we know this, it's very hard to communicate to politicians, and I think it's not because politicians are naive or incompetent, it's because we are missing this link of how to people having a factory outside Burgas or having a big factory in Saloniki is still considered something of first order, despite the fact that the factory will not employ as many workers as perhaps in the past. Now, there's also kind of work by Daron and many others. There is a kind of similar automation shock happening concurrently with automation, although the evidence, at least the empirical one, do find a relationship between automation and populism, which is, however, not so strong, perhaps because of identification challenges. Now, turning to shocks, rather than let me just show you, so this could be on your left, changes of unemployment on changes with populist voting during the Great Recession, with every point here being a different European region. So Tuscany will be one observation, Catalonia will be another observation, Macedonia will be another observation. And what's kind of interesting, so this comes from my work with Evgenia Passari, Jan Algan, and Sergei Guriev, is kind of similar to changes to the relation between changes in unemployment during the Great Recession and voting for Brexit in the United Kingdom. But rather than, this correlation is kind of consistent with the story that the first big vintage of populism or authoritarianism in the 30s happened, perhaps not randomly in the 30s, because of the Great Depression at the time. So there's kind also of work that short-term, if you like, economic fluctuations kind of also matter. And perhaps more importantly, especially for a young institution such as the Council, this voting for populism, one could say, is just a symptom. It goes handy with a general distrust on, so this could be on national parliament, on European parliament. In the paper, we also have some results with trust in courts. Interestingly enough, it does not correlate with trust in police, in the army. So there seems to be also something kind of deeper distrust to some core institutions for capitalist societies or for democratic societies. The fact that, if Georgi and I have a dispute, there is going to be some judge who will arbitrate, if you like, this dispute rather than, through some other means. Now, what is perhaps more interesting, also the debate that I listened to yesterday, is how about policies? And one thing that featured prominently in Europe and in the US, although mostly in Europe, is that, let me go back to the United Kingdom, the administration of David Cameron and George Osborne in the early 2010s that replaced the administration of Gordon Brown decided to go with austerity. So they listened to some academics, we know this actually as a fact. Look, debt was rising because the governments stepped in to provide, if you like, fiscal stimuli and also the cost of the bank bailouts. So let's try to proceed with some austerity. Now, obviously this idea was exported to my country, which for good reasons actually, because nobody wanted to extend credit, had to do austerity. But here is what we know from a fantastic, fantastic paper of T.M. Fetcher at the American Economic Review, where he estimates the cost across every electoral district from the austerity that the administration implemented at the time. Housing allowances were cut, support for social security was cut, so there was kind of a significant kind of cuts. And this tends to correlate with voting for UKIP. We have forgotten about this party, but this was the very first party of Nigel Farage as a party leader. Then he dropped it, and then he renamed it as Reform, and he will rename it again because he's a genius in marketing. Now, and so this comes from the FT, where they have been trying to trace the effect of austerity, which has been first order. Now, interestingly enough, also for the more macro people in the room, there are also kind of papers looking at the fiscal multiplier of that, which is close to 2, which means that although the government did that to try to spend less, in the end, it turned to be also counterproductive even to collect on the budget of the state. So, with one policy, you had like 2 adverse effects, going far right, and at the same time not being able to reduce the fiscal deficit, which was the initial thought ex ante. Now, on immigration, the effects are kind of weak empirically, so there is space for good research here, because there are very challenging empirical identification, if you prefer, kind of problems. So what are those? First of all, most immigrants in the UK live in London or in the big cities. The big cities tend to vote way more for centrist parties or liberal parties rather than anti-immigration parties. Why is that? There is a lot of sorting, both of immigration and also of locals. You have spillover, so a simple control treatment designed most likely will not work. And most importantly, I would go to point 7. There is a very big gap between perceptions and reality. Stefani Stancheva, a great Bulgarian economist, Alberto Alesina, one of the giants of the profession who sadly passed away, were start doing this amazing, I would say, kind of work. In some sense, it's kind of simple, but at the time we hadn't fully understood. Let's ask people, what do you think is the share of immigrants in the United Kingdom? Well, people in the UK, at least when Stephanie and Alberto did that, this would be 2017 or something, they would say that 1 out of 3 people living in the UK are immigrants. I mean, the reality is around 15%. Very big differences between perception and reality, also in other issues such as the American dream, taxation, globalization. And also, perhaps more importantly, we can quarrel about the exact statistics, because how do you count, for example, someone who has an even worse Greek accent than me, who, however, to Americans, who is an American citizen. So there are issues exactly how you measure. But what is kind of interesting here is that Americans were asked, tend to believe that the immigrants are poor. So they tend to believe that 40% of the poor in the US are immigrants. In reality, it's 10%, if not less. Now, what's happening is that people, when you ask them about immigration, at least in the US, they tend to think of someone working, I don't know, in the kitchen of a place that you are dining. Well, they fail to realize that the CEO of Alphabet, of Microsoft, right, they're immigrants. Even their idol, Elon Musk, is also an immigrant, right? So you don't tend to fact that Alex here is an immigrant, I presume, in the US, and he's like a distinguished professor at Stern. So you tend to be, you have like this weird kind of stereotypes, which I think as economists, although there is some exciting work on that, we don't fully understand why this is the case. So for example, in Sweden, the encouraging news, although the surge of the Sweden Democrats is there, is that at least perceptions with reality are not so dissimilar. Now, let me turn to culture. Now, culture, in my work on cultural economics, there is this idea put forward by Pippa Norris and Roland Inglegard, two very distinguished political scientists at Harvard, where, let me just give you the story. I have no idea whether it's true because it's very hard to test. But their story is the following. And it's kind of US specific. Well, we see in the US, in this period that has been coined as the Great Society, so this would be the 60s, with Lyndon Johnson, a bit with Jack Kennedy before, you had the emancipation of women, more generally in labor force, but more generally in the household and in economic activity. At the same time, you had a lot of legislation trying to emancipate effectively African Americans and other kind of racial minorities. In some sense, the Republican Party recall that in the US, the Democrat Party was the racist party. This was done under LBJ, a Democrat from the South. Very interesting work by Liana Kuziemko, that this actually is the deep reason why the Democrats lost the South. With Reagan, the Republicans embraced this agenda because Reagan, in various talks, is pro-immigration. And according to Norris and Inglegard, what we see today is a counter-revolution. You know, people thought that this went too far, perhaps, that it went too quickly, and now they see kind of a backlash, both against the traditional Republicans and also the Democrats who embraced and even promoted this agenda. This story could be true, with kinds of reasonable. It's very hard to pinpoint in the data because one could say, why in 2015 and not in 2005 or even in 1995? Perhaps because this interacts, you have some interactive effects between culture and economics. Let me say a problem, at least of applied work, and I'm part to blame here, is that there has been an obsession with identification, which means that stories related to interactive effects or to more general equilibrium kind of effects were kind of missed, at least from empirical kind of work. So what I think, let me just show you one example of, I would say, very innovative work on time-varying culture coming from Ben Enke. So this is a non-representative sample, so but based on very large samples, so almost 250,000. So Bernanke, speaking a lot with political scientists and philosophers at Harvard, and again based on research of political philosophers, kind of distinguished between two sets of moral values. What he calls, drawing on political philosophy, universal cultural values. So universal cultural values is that Alex cares a lot about poverty in Mozambique, cares a lot about the abuse of women in Guatemala. So this is like a global, universal morality. And what they coined as very local morality, where, you know, my father comes from a village in the Peloponnese, I deeply care about poverty and living conditions there. So you have this kind of divergent, let me say, political philosophers do not take a stand whether universal values are better than communal values. But what is kind of interesting is that you have significant across space variation on those values in the United States. And most important, I think this is a fantastic kind of graph, which shows what? In the 50s and the 60s, so this is based on some textual analysis of speeches of American congressmen and senators. And I think also the president. So what Ben shows is that in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, politicians of both parties, when they were delivering speeches, they would be way more universalist versus communal. So perhaps they would say global freedom. Let's lift children in Africa from poverty. Interestingly enough, in the 80s, sometimes starts, I don't know, in the 70s or so, like eyeballing econometrics, we see that politicians from both parties start becoming more communal. And the Democrats overdid it. So, and they become more universalist. So, you know, they become, and now we kind of see a convergence back to a more balanced kind of stuff. So again, what does this say? It says that in the 50s and the 60s, after the end of World War II, politicians of both parties cared about the local community. Over time, they became more globalized, more universal, in line with economics, especially after 80s. But perhaps the Democrats overshoot it. So they were way more, if you like, universalist as they were. So lastly, what do we know about social media? Well, there is, let me say, I'm not a contributor on this research, although I wanted at some point. So we have a lot of evidence that social media has been a contributing factor to the rise of polarization. There is, as I said, interesting work by Sergey and Katya at the QG on the spread of mobile internet in the US and being much more communal, if you like, ideology and voting for authoritarian kind of parties. There is an interesting work also by Milena on media slant and the political message, and I think we need more about that. So why some politicians are very good at using keywords. So many of my colleagues, including me, I was very dismissal to Trump because he says awesome, terrible, sad, right? But we have, I think, more and more evidence that this communication style resonates, perhaps not with the professors that debate about standard errors or, you know, whether the hunk should have another state variable or not, but it resonates with people, and I think we need to understand this this way more. So, again, I was discussing earlier with some colleagues here, we also have something that we don't fully understand. When there are lies, I think there is some work in behavioral science and behavioral economics that people want to spread lies, but still lies that immigration is super bad kind of spreads way more than an extreme lie coming from the far left. So I don't think we fully understand why this is the case, and I think more work is needed in that. Again, I don't want to go to the specificities of each paper. Perhaps what is more worrisome, especially if one was to think about AI, is that it's not a simple thing that I follow Donald Trump or I follow Elon Musk and then I vote for them. It seems a more kind of general ideological shift, much more authoritarian in the sense that I distrust the political parties and therefore I trust the leaders, not the Republican Party anymore. I distrust the courts, which means that I want a judge who is not necessarily the best judge but reflects my ideology. It points to kind of a much more, if you like, degradation of the institutional fabric and the social norms and beliefs that make this institutional fabric robust in some sense. Again, this shows from the work, I think this paper is forthcoming in Econometrica, that the expansion of the broadband interest led to a precipitous fall of trust in government. This was going to be based in the US, variation being on the expansion of 3G, which was heterogeneous for some geographic reason. Nikita Melnikov will have something similar on that. Let me not bother you with more statistics from papers, rather than pointing out an example which is very close to me. I have been an immigrant since 1999, and I've lived in New York, Frankfurt, London, Hanover, New Hampshire, where we didn't even have a lock there, and then back to London with some brief stints in Zurich. For the very first time that my beloved aunt called me to see whether everything is okay, it was kind of a couple of months ago, because she was reading in the news that London is apparently one of the most violent places on planet Earth. By the way, I do a lot of research in Africa, so she would not ask me when I go to Johannesburg or to Maputo, or when I go to a place in rural America, I would get this question as of 2 months. Now, what is happening? Well, there is in any case, European capital cities, thank God for us, since many of us are European, are not violent, especially if you contrast with the US. If anything, crime in London has been falling, let me say, with the exception of theft of mobile phones. But then if you follow the news, it seems that, there is warfare now in Kiev and London, which is clearly not the case. So, looking at past events, we have convincing, I would say, evidence that, this misinformation spreads online, and it does alter people's views. Sergey and Katya have very interesting work that even simple interventions, can have significant effects. If you recall at some point, so this is their Econometrica paper, Twitter or Facebook, perhaps both, they had, when someone was posting something, there was kind of a small message, most likely this is false, so there was kind of a small message there, which of course Twitter and Facebook, once Trump got elected, they took off. So even an intervention like that can have big effects. Or sometime, I think, again, one of the two platforms allowed you either to follow the post of your friends or more general. When you had the more general, the algorithm was feeding you with a lot of lies vis-a-vis when you follow your friends, or like most trust. So interventions like those, although to me ex ante, I would have said they don't matter. Actually, we have more and more work that at least locally, they do matter. So let me now turn to implications. So what do we know about the effects of populism? Well, just because the populist surge happened in the 2010s, starting perhaps a bit earlier, we had way more research on the driving forces vis-a-vis the implications, right? So that's the first caveat. And then the second caveat is, of course, populism, as we just discussed, is not random. So the papers there, if you're like coming from the identification police, fall asleep. It's really hard to push on the causal effects, but I would say we have more and more evidence that there seems to be kind of, perhaps, some indication that the effect between authoritarian populism and economic, institutional, and social outcomes is at least to some extent reflecting a causal relationship. Let me tell you what we know. I'll come, or perhaps I need to discuss this ex ante, and I think Danny Roderick is doing a great service to the profession by being provocative and pushing us to think. It is ex ante not clear that all populist policies are bad economics. I would say that in many models, at least in political economy, extreme inequality correlates with adverse outcomes on many things. So one could say if there is some form of redistribution, and redistribution, at least in the Benabou et al. Model, can be in terms of schools, in terms of infrastructure, this is perhaps a good policy. Roderick makes a very good analogy to the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, who became American president after McKinley got assassinated. And at the time, Teddy Roosevelt reflecting what, although he was coming from the Republican Party, the Democratic Party at the time was the so-called populist party. He took many policies, and perhaps the most important one for economics and the most well-studied is the antitrust legislation. So we all kind of agree, to a lesser or greater extent, that the Sherman Act and the antitrust movements and the breakdown of the cartels and the trust has contributed considerably to the rise of the US. At the time, this was coined as a populist policy. Also, FDR's policies were also deemed populist at the time. And we now have a lot of evidence that they kind of helped. So with this caveat in mind, let me show you some kind of evidence. So these are so-called synthetic control estimates. So here you see the evolution of GDP in the United Kingdom. What you see here with red is kind of a weighted average. So this is a synthetic control method of Abadi et al., where effectively what you do is very, very simple. It sounds complicated, but it's very simple. So you try to match up until 2014, the GDP of the UK, let's say, is a weighted average of what's happening in Ireland, in Spain, and in Italy. So this would be 33, 33. And then you project forward. You can use, interestingly enough, the projection from the Bank of England or the OECD. Clearly, there is a trend change, roughly speaking, at the time of Brexit. Now, let me give you some more updated series. So this is about real wages. So this is inflation and inflation-adjusted kind of wages. This is business investment. This comes from work, I think, of Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen and various colleagues. So there is increasingly more and more, and of course there are many micro studies, which I copy here, suggesting that Brexit causally has contributed to the decline of output growth in the UK in the past decade. Let me just say this is, again, experiential econometrics rather than, Python econometrics. Living in the UK, you can sense that. It's clearly, I arrived in the UK in 2012, it's clearly that after 2016, something has changed, even in London, which seems to be kind of relatively insulated. There is more and more work that, if anything, London got impacted way more than the more suburban kind of places. And perhaps places for areas of future work is to go more on the spatial or the racial, perhaps, inequities or distributional kind of effects of such policies. Now, Funke et al., in a paper published at the American Economic Review, they tried to do something similar, so synthetic controls, going back to the turn of the 20th century, relying a lot on ad hoc classifications of populism, which are far from great, but not bad either, so use them cautiously. One could debate their chronology, but in some sense, this is what comes out from their analysis. Authoritarian populism comes with a cost on output, both for populists like Perón, that comes, let's say, from the left, and for populists, let's say, such as Bolsonaro. These are two examples from their paper that comes from the right. If you break it by period, left-wing populist leaders were particularly detrimental up until 1990. Subsequently, if anything, it has been slightly different, with actually most of the adverse effects on output coming from quote-unquote populist leaders classified as coming from the right. Let me again say that this, just because we had this discussion in Venice, even this classification, I come from the left or on the right, perhaps in some cases we can agree, in some other cases there is reasonable space for debate. Perhaps most importantly, we have more and more kind of work showing that the effect of having a populist party or a populist leader is not only short-term in the terms of higher inflation or weaker economic activity, but perhaps more importantly on institutional decline. And although the data is not great, I need to stress that, especially given your role advising the government, they have either in the end of their AR paper or in some appendix, some results with inequality. Of course, inequality was not well measured in 1910 in Bulgaria or in 1915 in Greece, so there are measurement errors here. But it doesn't seem to be a trade-off between lower economic activity, higher inflation, and lower inequality. If anything, inequality slightly goes up. Clearly, it's not moving much. So this idea that someone like Perón will come to power and through fiscal policy, which perhaps is detrimental to aggregate activity, at least some people will benefit, and those will be the poor or the lower middle class, it doesn't seem to be the case, at least with the available data we have so far. So looking forward, here again I'm trying to be very speculative, so feel free to disagree, is how exactly the societies and the economic structure will evolve in the years to come, and how geopolitical considerations play a role. Because I understand that economists, based on their arrogance, they viewed people who were working on geopolitics and international relationships in a cocky way, because we were way better in math. Not me, my colleagues. But over time, it has become clearer and clearer on those issues. Perhaps it's no coincidence that 60s, 70s, 80s, populism, Latin America, redistribution. Over time, we have a movement in Europe and the US and across the world, which is now not anymore of this style, is of a different style. This kind of clearly correlates with the fall of the Iron Curtain. Then the more recent surge of anti-immigration identity kind of populism, again global, by no means only in Latin America, if anything less so, one could say in Latin America, although now in Colombia it featured prominently in the elections. So there seems to be this kind of global trends that we don't fully understand. For the younger people in the room, I should have put perhaps a great paper by Primiceri, I think with Paco Buera in Econometrica, on learning from the experiences of other countries. There's also an interesting paper at the JPE, if I'm not mistaken, by Marco Tabellini on how you learn democratic rules. So, perhaps Bulgaria sees how Greece did it. Hopefully you learn the good things and not the bad things. So I think there is more work to be done kind of there. So let me conclude, and it's great that I kept it on time. So this was my concluding slide. So I was asked to give a talk at the FT. They have some lunches, actually without serving lunch, on FTSE 100 executives. So that was my concluding line, because they wanted to be forward-looking. Can you guess where this quote comes from? Excellent. I was surprised that this is from the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels. So what I find is kind of interesting, I was telling my colleagues later, that all of them knew. So these are like the CEOs of the biggest, not only CEOs, but chief operating officers of the largest US companies, of the largest British companies. I mean, they were not all there, but let's say there were 50. Some of them could even rehearse the previous part and the later part. And I was telling this to my colleagues, I found it very interesting that, you know, at least to go to the very top, you need to have done your communist training. So I had it there with those two kind of books, because I think, and this is when I talk every now and then with policymakers, I think there are two views among the elites today. View number one is that, okay, populists will be in power, economic policies are not good, sooner or later they will be voted out of power. So, you know, Orban lost. Perhaps Trump, if you classify him as a populist, he might lose, or, you know, his party. So there is kind of a view that, look, political competition is a great thing. Pay close attention to institutions, so you make sure that the elections are free and impartial and that you don't do redistricting or, you know, other kind of interventions in the elections. And the voters will vote out the populists. So it's a story about political competition. And because of that, sooner or later, the optimists will say sooner, we will revert to the let's say, 2010, 2008 kind of period where globalization was not challenged at all, I would say, or very little. And then there is a second view, your call which one to subscribe to, that says this, look, these kind of events have been monumental. The fact that China entered the World Trade Organization meant that a country as large of China with 1.5 billion people is now an integral part, not only of the trade, but also the financial system. You had this response, not only to China, among voters in the West, to these adverse economic shocks and the expansion of ideology and people movement. And perhaps we live in a new world. I would say that if you were to view AI as a form of technology, as I guess as it is, and you take a Marxist view, Marxist not in terms of voting or ideology, but in terms of Hegelian, if you prefer, a kind of view that changes in the way the economy is structured will have an effect on how we behave and how we govern through institutions social and economic activity, then most likely you will be of the view that, look, it's going to perhaps be utopian or a bit counterproductive to try to restore the previous order, because to start with, voters rejected or at least challenged some elements of the previous order. Let me say that this is very speculative. I have no research whatsoever. I see more and more people trying to work on AI and the implications mainly on the labor markets. To give two ideas that I've been thinking is on automation, and one could draw analogies to the AI. Perhaps people like Georgi, that you do those surveys, perhaps you can ask people not only about how you view AI, but how you think AI will change how we interact. For example, works on automation find weak effects with populism. My hunch is because even those who have not in the past been directly affected are also worried that they might be affected. So you don't have such a clean control treatment. With AI, this applies perhaps even more, but there could be clever ways to inform policy, which I guess is the mantra of the Bulgarian Council of Economic Advisors, and have like more to say on that. Thank you so much for your time. Very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Have about 10 minutes for questions, so yeah, so we'll start there.
Hello, my question is with respect to the election process, because near the end you mentioned that as far as the process is kept fair, usually the populists, if they're not successful for the welfare of society, they will be voted out. But how often have there been attempts, and even successful ones, by the populists who are in power to deter the next fair election so that they can remain in power at the cost of society?
So that's a great question. So my recommendation, or the way I think about it, my view has changed, is that we can think, so there is another strand of research, which goes actually to my PhD years, on democracy and growth. Now, research on democracy and growth, setting aside causality, which again is very hard because democratizations are not random events. So this work that is already out there points out that democracies are associated with higher economic activity, and especially autocratic reversals go handy with a collapse of economic activity. Now, when with Greg Skirounis we compiled a measure of democratization in our PhD years, which subsequently Daron Acemoglu kind of followed and expanded, our job was kind of easy because political scientists, and this is where we drew, it's very easy to classify Pinochet or Videla as being non-democratic. They were wearing a uniform. And there was a clear coup that, you can go and check. There wasn't, we were coming with a classification. I remember the referees never even went that. It was very, very well defined. Now, to quote the great work of Sergei Guriev with Daniel Treisman, that they call informational autocrats, autocracy is taking a different route. People that you might classify as non-democratic will not appear with military uniforms. You will not be able to identify a coup, like the one, in the presidential palace of Chile, the Americans bombard, Allende delivers his last speech, he commits suicide, Pinochet and the army are there the next day. Which makes it harder to pinpoint to specific events. So we had a debate in Venice on whether Maduro and Chavez are, now it's clear that they are autocrats. But Chavez took power through the institutional means of Venezuela. So I think that we should try to have those two literatures on democracy and outcomes and authoritarian populism and outcomes coming more together, because what we see here is this gradual degradation of institutions, which I think a very good example is Orban. He got democratically elected, then he did redistricting, then he got his own people to get the media. There's a great paper in Econometrica by Adam Zeidel on that. Over time, the checks and balances that were there were kind of weakened. And I think this is the big danger, at least if you buy, and then I buy this research, that the positive correlation between institutions and economic efficiency, to some extent at least, reflect a causal relationship.
Great. Let's go here and then.
Nikolai Denchev from the University of National and World Economy. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Now my question is, so I felt you went from well institutionalized to populism. Do you have knowledge on the other way around, from populism toward good working institutions and less populism?
Yes, so there are, so in this paper at the AR, you have also indications of swings on the other kind of side. So Argentina, for example, you have Perón, and then you have the dictatorship, but for example, under Alfonsín will not be classified as a populist. Menem and Cavallo, so this would be Argentina in the 90s, according to most classifications, although not all, again will not be classified as populist. So you do have, from populist rule to non-populist rule.
But what are the factors? How does it go?
Well, this I don't recall the heterogeneity as I mentioned before, so let me not comment on something that.
Thank you for an extremely interesting talk. I'm trying to process, and I think this quote at the end is actually very useful from Marx, because is it what you're saying that in the end it is kind of about the economics and those drivers, and if we get those right, whether it's the aggregate growth and the inequality side of things, that's really what matters, whereas immigration, culture, maybe media is a little bit downstream from that. You didn't quite say it, so I'm just wondering and pushing a little bit to see if that's, because I thought that would be a pretty optimistic message in the end, actually, at least for people in this room, if it is about the economics.
That's actually a very good question. So I will not have an answer, but there's kind of an interesting element here. Political scientists, at least on democracy, they would be obsessed with how the economic structure, not necessarily simply GDP or education, but more the economic structure, shapes democracy and non-democracy and the institutions at place, which has, I think, a Hegelian Marxian element. Now, economists, so this would be the early work of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, reversed it, and they try to think, how does changing in institutions affect causally things? To be fair on what you're saying, Acemoglu, Robinson, the book, which draws a lot on their theory paper at the AR and the QG, would be actually on both sides. So it would be like general equilibrium settings where you start with inequality, economic activity shapes the institutional structure, which in turn shapes development, featuring actually multiplicity. So you could be stuck. So if you start with very high land inequality, you might be stuck in a low productivity authoritarian kind of regimes. If you're kind of lucky and you don't have natural resources and high land inequality, it might be easier to transit to the modern sector, manufacturing at the time, which in turn will lead to more dispersed economic power, which in turn, because of commitment, the industrialists will want independent courts, will want more democratic rule, which in turn will be self-sustaining democracy development. So we have models of that sort. Again, if I was to be critical to recent research, also in this work, in this review we did with Sergey had those statistics. I think we are citing 350 papers or books, papers and books. Setting aside the books from poli-science, something like 80%, if not more, of the papers are empirical or reduced form. Let's try to identify that rather than thinking more conceptually through this, how we can think about interactions and dual kind of feedback, which I think is effectively what happens.
Final question.
Thinking about your last slide, if we think that AI will bring inequality to an extreme, like thinking of like a lot of resources, capital share very large, labor share very low, how does populism look like in an extremely unequal way? Because you could think of redistribution, but what we saw with Trump is that you're actually even reinforcing the seeds of that.
Okay, thanks for the question. I have an answer. And I have an answer because I need to discuss a paper on AI in 2 days. I see some people, I admire their work and I consider friends, debating about this question all the time, making super bold statements. And I keep wondering, why on earth do you enter this super speculative discussion? And since I'm not at their level, again, it's hard for me to see how things will play out. The only aspect I think we need to remember, and clearly this is verified both from good empirical studies but also from the history, is that the answer to this question depends a lot on policies. So it's not kind of a rule of nature that AI will lead the world to more inequality or more polarization. To a great extent, this is it's going to be driven also by the policies that we, as society or as policymakers, kind of discuss. So I have a very strong opinion, for example, on the mistake I think that Western societies are made with the expansion of social media, that they took a very market-friendly approach. This is something new, let's let it go, let's see how things play out, and then regulate. Which, let me say, I understand the logic. But now we have very compelling evidence of adverse effects. Again, but this is about the past, it's not necessarily about... So I could have foreseen a different... my favorite example, which is, let me preamble what I will say in Greece, is that in Greece, we regulate whether you advertise in the TV toys. Still, I think you cannot advertise in Greek TV toys. You regulate massively in every TV show. You will see for something like 5 seconds, this is not allowed to under 16 for this and this reason, this is not allowed. So we regulate these things very well. We prevent a small shopkeeper to sell some type of magazines. And then somehow we said, it's fine now if in social media you advertise toys, not to say what else you advertise. Right? So it was a conscientious decision not to do that. So my answer to AI is I have no idea. I'm not that smart. What I think is that we can intervene. Perhaps we don't want to intervene, but clearly how we deal with it will have an effect.
Great. Thank you so much. So round of applause.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.